title of my presentation this afternoon is Grazing Practices for GrassRich Intensive Grazing Systems. Briefly, by way of background, just in terms of the theme of this presentation, we're still talking about our core strength, our core competitive advantage, which is low-cost, high-performance, grass-based milk production systems. We know that those systems deliver the highest profit for farmers, are the most enjoyable and most socially acceptable systems for farmers to work within, but they also confer lots of other advantages. Most important to us now, in the sign of the times, they're environmentally the most efficient systems that we can have as dairy producers. So in terms of the long-term benefits for our industry, maintaining the core strengths of a grass-based system is essential. I suppose with the removals of quota in Ireland in the last number of years, in Europe indeed, I mean, you're seeing farmers now re-looking at their systems and looking at maybe redesigning them, looking at different aspects of the system, what to change to try and get better productivity. And that's perfect. It's good to always look and question and see how we can improve. I suppose one concern, though, would be that when we're looking at making decisions in terms of, the types of systems we have, you have to have a very ordered decision-making process about what to change first, then what to change next, and so on. So the theme of this presentation then is very much about an ordered series of decisions that will allow higher productivity within intensive grazing systems. Intensive systems are more difficult to manage, in terms of really it's like running faster. I mean, they need to be simpler than the average system. They need to be more robust. So the recommendations that are in this presentation are very much about accounting for the vagrancies of, milk prices being up and down, but also in terms of climate, that there will be years when we'll have poorer climate or unfavourable conditions for management. With more intensive systems, you really have to design a system that is robust to those vagrancies. So whether we're talking about increasing stocking rates or delaying calving dates, these are choices farmers will make. I'd like that today we look at how we make the series of decisions to improve productivity over the next number of years. Okay, so probably the biggest single decision farmers will make is about the stocking rate on their farms. This has a pervasive effect on everything else that will happen within the farm gate in the next 12 months. Okay, and just as an exercise, I thought what we do today is just look at a case study example as a group and see what happens when a farm changes stocking rate. There's a lot of information already collected about this, and what we're going to use now is the knowledge that's in the room to try and find the solutions to the questions, what happens to our farm system when we increase stocking rate? So I'm going to here. Okay, so congratulations to those. They know the answers. I think they deserve a round of applause. My advice to everybody else is to buy those guys a drink tonight, pull up a pew beside them and find out what else they know. But on a very serious note, we have done a lot of experiments, and we know that these, in fact, are the correct answers to those questions. When you increase stocking rate from 2.3, which is typical enough on most dairy farms today, to 2.8 cows per hectare, you will see a reduction in grazing season length, all else equal, in the order of 20 days. That means, though, that grazing days per hectare, when you multiply the grazing season length by the stocking rate, is still increasing. So there is more grass utilised in these higher stocking rate systems because you have more grazing days per hectare over the year, 645 grazing days per hectare expected. Milk production per cow declines by about 10%, okay? And that means that per hectare, you're seeing an increase. In fact, the increase in milk production per hectare that's realised in a higher stocking rate corresponds more or less exactly to the extra grazing days per hectare. So for farmers now wanting to, look at their own system and implement some kind of practices that are going to increase productivity in an efficient way, grazing days per hectare will very well match milk production output per hectare as you increase stocking rate and intensify into the future. Production costs also increase, and that's the challenge then for intensified systems, how to minimize the increase in production costs to maintain our competitiveness. I just want to put that challenge in real context. That if you take a farm system from 2.3 to 2.8 cows per hectare, you're talking about 20% extra feed inputs required within the system. It's an absolutely massive change in terms of feed requirements. And the question that arises then from that is, where does that feed come from? Who are we going to ring to supply that feed? And we know from the scientific evidence clearly states that if we have to purchase that feed into our farm systems, then it will be unprofitable. We will be less sustainable environmentally, and it will complicate the system in terms of those managing those farms. So, undesirable outcome if we're going outside the farm gate for this feed. In reality, from experimental results, we know there's 3 parts to meeting the feed requirements of more intensive systems. One is you have to grow more. So whether it be the soil fertility changes, whether it's the clover incorporation, whether it's just the grazing practices that are going to lift dry matter production on the farm, they all have to happen in order to sustain these higher stocking rates. You have to improve the quality of the feed. Again, grazing management practices are the main basis for that, and utilisation. All grazing management practice effects. So, I suppose the summary for me is two things to take from that so far. One, you're looking for things that will clearly show the benefits of more intensive systems. You need to get more grazing days per hectare. And for me, in our research herds now we're achieving about 800 grazing days per hectare on our farms. So when you're looking at stocking rates and looking at calving dates, if you're not building grazing days per hectare, you're probably not doing something that's beneficial in terms of grass utilisation and farm profitability. The second thing to say is it's unreasonable to expect that you can increase stocking rate on your farms and not change grazing practices in order to capture the extra efficiencies within a grazing system. Okay, so now we need to look back and say, well, what do we change? How do we change it? How can we get this 20% feed within the farm gate? And that's very much what the rest of this presentation is about. So let's outline it then in terms of what we're aiming for. In terms of what we're aiming for, an intensive system up to 2.9 livestock units per hectare with less than 500 kilos of supplement per cow. It's still a grass-focused, grass-rich system with a compact calving herd, very efficient, can produce around 1,400 kilos of milk solids per hectare. It's a huge level of productivity, much higher than even has been achieved with the top 10% of farmers at the moment. So that's there for us with the right practices. But, the challenge is then in terms of the grazing practices to deliver it. And these are the real targets. 16 tonnes of dry matter required to fuel that system. You're talking about a grazing season length of 276 days, so that's from start to finish, full grazing days, approximately 276 full grazing days achieved over the course of the season, or about 800 grazing days per hectare when you account for the stocking rate that you're implying. They're very, very stretched targets, they're very serious targets, and so, in terms of your practice change, it needs to be greater in order to achieve this. I mentioned grazing days per hectare as a target. I just like the idea of it because it's something that a farmer can easily measure on farm. It's not something that, grass utilisation is so closely measured in terms of farm profit, but in reality it's difficult on a day-to-day basis to look at what does that mean. Grazing days per hectare is what stocking rate are we at on the whole farm platform over the year, and how long is our grazing season in terms of full grazing season length. And within Clonakilty, Curtains, since 2009, we've measured every single paddock, every single grazing, every single year. And you can see that grass utilisation, the amount of grass that we're capturing through the dairy herds on these studies, increases linearly with extra grazing days per hectare. And so that 800 days target is right in the middle there. It's given us about 10, 11 tonnes of grass utilised down the throats of dairy cows. It doesn't account for the silage, which is also produced within the system. That's how we get up to these 12 and 13 tonnes of total utilised feed up here. It's based on 800 grazing days per hectare. So regardless of what you do in terms of stocking rate, calving dates and so on, that has to be something that you can practically implement now on your farm. Are you achieving this level of grazing intensity? So now we're moving on to the main decisions. And as I mentioned at the start, when we start thinking about the decisions now and how we change, it's very much an ordered array of decisions. So we start with the most important decision and we'll work our way down then towards the lesser important decisions. So number one up is stocking rate. It has a pervasive effect on everything else that will happen on the farm. It increases grass utilisation when it's done profitably. It's really powerful in terms of increasing extra productivity from a farm business. But where it's poorly implemented, well, more or less everything else you do, you can't really accommodate. You won't ever make up the difference by having the wrong stocking rate. So stocking rates that run in excess of the grass growth potential of a farm, you'll see them so evidently. The main time of the year when you'll see them is in April, because it'll mean animals will be on silage, there'll be low animal performance, and that's really a criminal error in terms of a grazing system. So it's very much a grass-based system where the stocking rate is appropriate to grass growth. I'd like everyone to remember when we talk about stocking rates that we're talking about the general averages of grass growth. That means that half of the time the grass growth, because of climate, will be less than our target. And a robust system is designed so that in those incidences, in those cases where grass growth is less than we want, the system is designed so that actually it doesn't crash the system. Okay? So we can all think of our best years of grass growth and set stocking rates at that level. But really, in terms of the type of systems we need now, You have to set it at some general average that's going to be achieved on average, and then the tactical changes will allow you to get over the years where grass growth is less. These are the targets, okay, and these are non-negotiable. In terms of targeting the correct stocking rate, it's based on grass growth. You need to know what's growing on the farm, first up, and then it's based on a decision around how much supplement are you reasonably prepared to incorporate into your system. For us, in a grass-based system today, 500 to 750 kilos, that's kind of the levels. The Moore Park herds would run at around 500 kilos. Most farmers are probably closer to 750 kilos of supplement incorporated per cow. That gives you the target in terms of supplement or stocking rate that you should run your farm business at. That's for a mature dairy operation. I acknowledge absolutely that there are farms today with less than mature herds, lots of young animals and so on just coming out of quotas, that perhaps are able to get away with slightly higher levels than this. But when you get towards the, getting up from 3.5 up to 5 lactations per cow within the herd, these are very much the targets for high productivity, high profitability, really good sustainability in terms of stocking rate. This is a strategic target. If you don't agree with these targets, if you don't implement these absolutely, it's difficult to correct for the problems that will arise from a poorly implemented system. Decision number 1. Decision number 2 then is calving date and pattern. Okay, so this is the second most important decision you have to make. In terms of start of calving and mean calving date, the general recommendation is that it should be 50 to 60 days before magic day on the farm. And the 50 to 60 days is accounting for wetter soils and lighter soils, heavier soils, and so on. So that's the general average, okay? And that's to allow us, as John has outlined, to increase, put animals on a rising plane of nutrition, turned out to grass from calving, and also to utilise all the feed that's available on the farm. So that's the principle, that's the basis for that objective in terms of mean calving date. That then transfers into a mean calving date for Irish dairy farms from about the 10th of February up to about the 25th of February, depending again on the specifics of soil type on the farm, grass growth habit, and so on. So that's the range. I put less emphasis actually on that than the compactness, because when we look at the statistics, we know that compactness is the real problem on most dairy farms, and it's the big challenge for grazing. If you look at the national statistics from the ICBF in 2016, on average only about 58% of animals calve in the first 6 weeks of the calving spread, instead of the 90% target. So it's difficult to start spending too much time talking about the mean calving date, given that we're not actually compact calving as a national industry today. We know that each 1% increase in calving rate in 6 weeks corresponds to about €8 per cow in extra profitability, both in terms of extra productivity, but less losses from infertility and so on. So that the average 100-cow herd today is losing around 27,000 because of outspread calving, not hitting the compact calving targets. These compact calving targets, they'll increase the demand on the farm, but the productivity benefits are great. So it's difficult to focus too much on mean calving date, given that we're quite outspread in terms of our calving pattern at this stage. This is strategic decision number 2, getting the herd compact calving, getting the mean calving date appropriate to the stocking rate that we've just decided on, but to the farm characteristics as well in terms of soil type and so on. Thirdly then, once we've decided on those two, we've checked the boxes in terms of we have the right appropriate stocking rate for our grass growth capability, we have the appropriate calving date to suit the farm. Now we're into the grazing practices. And the first grazing practice then is the feed budget. And John has outlined this already. I mean, in terms of 2 key points in the year for a farm in terms of managing the feed budget, the first one is when you calve. In 2-3 weeks' time, there should be 900 kilos of cover on the farm, above 3.5 centimetres, to allow you to feed animals well during springtime on a grass diet. To do that, you needed to have approximately 600 to 650 kilos of dry matter at turn-in at the 25th of November in order to achieve that. Or if you work backwards further back to when growth rate last exceeded animal requirements last September, there should have been around 1,200 kilos of cover on the farm at that point in order to facilitate the cover that we want in 2 weeks' time. So this is the target in terms of, and this is the basis for the recommendations. We know that having the target cover drives extra growth on the farm. Just as grazing out early in spring drives extra growth on the farm, having the target cover gives you extra dry matter production. In fact, from pasture base, we know that there's an extra 3 kilos of dry matter growing per day on farms for every 100 kilos of farm cover that they have in springtime. So, Hitting the targets in terms of average farm cover actually grows more in terms of your overall farm system. It also reduces costs, and we estimate that the cost reduction in feed costs particularly is about €15 per cow per 100 kilos of farm cover for spring. So really, really important to hit those targets. I suppose just going around and visiting groups and looking at what people are doing, I think it's fair to say that farmers are more afraid of this level here, this high farm cover in autumn. They see it as an issue. They invariably don't achieve that. When you look at the pasture-based data set particularly, farmers aren't achieving that level. Consequently, they're running out of grass too quickly in autumn. They don't have the cover to start to calving. It's a kind of a vicious cycle. So building the cover, hitting and sticking to the targets, and having that feed for spring is going to be the way to fuel a high productivity grazing system, particularly as you intensify. Obviously, it needs to be adjusted for our wetter farms, and that's absolutely acknowledged. Whether you look at the Ballyhaise site in terms of our experiments or the wetland dairy programme, if you're operating on a wetter soil type, you do have to adjust. Other things that you need to be aware of, on wetter farms, poaching is even more serious. You have to avoid it. One advantage I do see of higher stocking rates and intensive systems is, if you do have a wet day in springtime, it's not the end of the world if you have to hold animals off, if you have a high enough demand. Because, the benefits of not poaching the pastures, you have high demand. You will catch up in terms of utilising that grass before the end of the first rotation. So, that is an advantage in terms of sward management for sure. Just then, in terms of main grazing season residuals, this is something I think farmers really do need to relook at. Grazing residuals, we put a lot of emphasis on it, but when you go out on farms, you do see big difference in terms of grazing practices. The target is between 3.5 and 4 centimetres. That should be the post-grazing residual. Every 1 centimetre that the farm is above that 3.5, 4 centimetres, you're talking about 250 kilos of dry matter per centimetre of wasted material. Lost productivity, that feed decays, it perishes, it's gone, and you have to find feed somewhere else to replace it. That becomes more costly when you're at higher stocking rate. So, any lost productivity in residuals is a big problem. The target residuals lead denser swards, higher quality swards, and faster regrowths. So those are all important parts of the overall situation. Even in terms of the best farmers, which will be involved in the pasture-based cultivar evaluation, they struggle with mid-season grazing residuals. Average residuals in mid-season coming through, we're measuring those, are around 4.5 centimetres. So, in the general scheme of things, farmers need to put more emphasis on post-grazing residuals. I think every group, every farm should invest in a plate meter of some sort just to get out there and measure residuals. It's not evident, it's not obvious walking around on your own farm just that, this is how I graze, that you're grazing to 4 centimetres. It can be very, very deceptive. In terms of hitting the targets for grazing residuals, it's also important to bear in mind that if you're targeting a 4 centimetre grazing residual in mid-season, you need to be grazing below that in spring and in autumn, because stem elongation occurs during that first, between April, May, June. So if you want to hit a target 4 centimetres here, you have to be below that at the two sides of the year. So in fact, what's happening on farms, I think, is that the grazing intensity in spring and autumn isn't low enough, and consequently mid-season we struggle to keep a cap on these grazing residuals. So that's definitely a theme, something to look at for more intensive systems. To summarise then, just in terms of grazing practices, I just wanted to introduce some of the thoughts for you in terms of the order of decision making. The two most important things are the stocking rate and the calving date. Once you've designed those two, you're well on your way to a more intensive, efficient, grass-based, high-productivity system. Maximise grass utilisation, I think everyone generally accepts that. A measure I'd add that you can look at now is grazing days per hectare as a great way of being able to judge this on your farm with members of your local discussion group and so on to see, are we actually achieving better grass utilisation on our farms? It's a very good measure. Sticking to the target feed covers, and being relentless in terms of achieving those targets. That's critically important, particularly at calving and at peak in autumn, and achieving the target post-grazing residuals of 3.5 to 4 centimetres. That's a big part of the extra grass utilisation that will be required in more intensive production systems in the future. I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks very much.